Why don't we get started? I want to welcome everyone tonight. My name is David Van Zandt, and I'm the president here at the New School, and it's great to see you all out here for this program. It's a very timely program, and immediately after the program, we are going to be broadcasting the vice presidential debate up on the screen behind us, and I encourage everyone to stay if you wish, and watch it together. This is a wonderful program for the New School. It is an intersection of media and politics. Those are two areas in which the New School has always been strong, and it reflects our two principles here at the New School: one of being creative and innovating and being on the cutting edge and questioning the status quo, and the other of being engaged socially in trying to improve the world. And the New School has had a long tradition of being a forum for public debate on current issues. This also relates well to our programs, our different programs in media and public policy. We have undergraduate and graduate programs in media studies. Students in those programs learn to understand media theory and also to be media creators and managers. In addition, we have public policy programs that provide sound foundation in theory and practice of urban policy analysis and management. We have with us a number of distinguished speakers tonight, and I'll just quickly say their names so they can wave to you. Andy Heyward, who's the former president of CBS. Victor Navasky, who's the former editor and publisher of The Nation, and also a presidential campaign mismanager, I'm told. He'll tell you more about that, I think. Nina Khrushcheva is an associate professor of international affairs here at the New School. Justin Elliott is a reporter for ProPublica. And finally, Jeffrey Smith, the assistant professor of politics and advocacy at the Milano School. I'd now like to turn the program over to Dean Neil Grabois, the dean of the Milano School of International Affairs and Public Policy. Neil?
Thank you very much. And welcome to all of you. We did not realize when we began to work out this program, first, that there would be a debate, and second, that the Yankees would get this far. My wife had convinced me that they would, but I don't always agree with my wife. In any case, this is a special evening for us, whether there's baseball or there's a debate, and we were pleased that the debate didn't start till 9, and our intention is to be finished in plenty of time so that those of you who wish to join us for the debate will in fact be able to do so. Clearly, this particular moment in our own history, and in fact our current events with the recent debate, presidential debate, with the vice president debate, and I think another 3 debates coming up.
2 more.
And 2 more. Thank you, the political scientists. I'm a mathematician, so don't expect me to know things like that. But with 2 more debates coming up, and the interplay of politics, reporting on the debates, judgments made about the reporting, judgments made about the self-presentations, all make our conversation today particularly apposite. And I use the word conversational, or conversation intentionally. There will be essentially no presentations, except I'll make a few preliminary remarks. I will ask some questions I hope will be leading questions that will, in fact, perhaps, I can't say in fact perhaps, but that will likely generate some communication, some interchange among this distinguished panel. And we have, in fact, assembled an extraordinary group of people. And you've heard from the president what some of their accomplishments are. There are many more. If you don't know Monocle Magazine, I don't remember when it ended.
Our last issue was $5 for 10 issues, or subscription price, or $7.50 for a lifetime subscription. So by some theories, it's never ended. We came out like the UN police force whenever there was an emergency and whenever we could solve the financial crisis.
Okay.
And we called ourselves a radical sporadical.
So we have represented in this particular group a quite extraordinary group of people. As I suggested, we have one former state senator, Jeff Smith. We have, as you know, a person who ran CBS News. We have somebody who represents new media. And we have somebody who represents the kind of long-form artistic view of the world and who's written a spectacular book. I'm not supposed to advertise books on Nabokov, which I think Nina's book is fantastic, and I recommend it to you. I won't recommend other people's books, but in fact, I think we have quite an interesting group who reflect a variety of perspectives on the media. Now, they undoubtedly overlap, but nevertheless have particular insights into various forms. And we are, as technology develops, and I will perhaps, slip back and forth between technology and the media, simply because telephones are becoming part of the media. And pretty soon we'll all be implanted with something, with the right kind of eyeglasses and that little thing in the back of the neck that was on some TV show, Matrix. And you will be informed on a regular basis what the score is, so you don't have to check the scores. In any case, when we look at the development of media and how various cultures have responded, we have the samizdat, which were self-publications of important political and literary activities in the Soviet Union, which had quite an effect on the Soviet Union at the time. And I think I'll ask a pointed question of Nina to talk a little bit more about that. We've gone through the Arab Spring with various mob collections using technology and the media. We've had, as well, interesting issues in more repressive countries when individuals and larger groups of individuals have begun to use media and technology to push back, especially on regimes that they have resented for some time. And I recently listened to a conversation with Salman Rushdie, and there was a fatwa. The politics was being, in some way, intensified through the media, and fortunately, that's over. I wanted to say just a word about the ground rules. The first ground rule is that we will not be relitigating Citizens United. We'll simply accept it. It's constitutionally approved. One hopes that there will be changes made, but we have to accept it, and it's having a profound effect, I think, on many of us. But beyond that, the worries about the courts and politics are substantial, and the courts are being affected in some places, especially state courts, where, in fact, some judges are political figures and have to run for office, and money is pouring in, and I think there's some recent case of 3 judges who made a particular decision, and efforts are being made to funnel plenty of money in to, in fact, bounce them. So we have this interplay among politics, the media, and what stands behind the media, which is money, Citizens United or not. And that interplay, it seems to me, is at the heart of what we're going to try to help unravel for ourselves and for you. I wanted to read 2 quotes for you, which I happen to find at least somewhat profound. One from Michael Sandel, who is a professor of political philosophy, I think, at Harvard, who wrote, "The global media and markets that shape our lives beckon us to a world beyond boundaries and belonging. But the civic resources we need to master these forces are still to be found in the places and stories, memories and meanings that situate us in the world and give our lives their moral particularity." And another quote from David Foster Wallace, "In a media-mediated age, we are nothing but minds waiting to be filled, emotions waiting to be manipulated. there is a sense that our obsession with being entertained has deadened our affect, that we are not choosing carefully enough what we want to love. And I read these because I feel that they touch me in a way that is somewhat disturbing, but we live in a different kind of world from the world that I grew up in which I would lie down underneath the radio to listen to the radio, and that was all there was. Now the world is rather different, and we'll have to just deal with it. If we tried to characterize the media, I will use my own invented notions of such characterizations, which are a little slippery. We have asymmetric communication through the media, where we hear from the media, but we can't directly speak back. And newspapers, TV are certainly asymmetric in that sense. You can provide some insights, but it's not an easy thing to do. We have symmetric media, like social networking, where everybody has an equal opportunity to speak to the world of his or her own choosing. We have narrow focus media, Fox, MSNBC, which are speaking generally to a very well-defined, if I may put it that way, audience that sees the world in a particular way. We have broad focus, and I would say newspapers and TV are certainly broad focus. They speak in a number of voices and in a number of ways. And we have those media that are really hard to control, and that inability to control with ease is plaguing some countries in Africa, is plaguing some speech that we would like to see in our country open and exciting, and is giving fits to the Chinese on occasion and to others we can name because they can't control it as well as they would like, but are making tremendous efforts to do so. The focus this evening will be on how politics interacts and impacts and is impacted by the new and the old media. And sometimes that impact is indirect. And I would say in Greece, in Spain, there's possibly a substantial impact of media on how people are reacting. And then we want to understand the comparative picture of how the media is behaving, because I don't think it's uniquely an American issue. I would say Putin has certain responses to media. Angela Merkel, somewhat different. Sarkozy was his own person with respect to the media. Hollande, perhaps quite different. And the British disasters clearly indicate a very different newspaper history and a different way in which people hack and use their powers in ways we would find most uncomfortable. The impact of money has become gigantic. I don't know if you noticed that the estimate for Obama's expenses, together with whatever his name is, Romney, that the impact of the two together is about $2 billion, $1 billion for each. That is absolutely extraordinary, and undoubtedly, until something happens that I can't envision, is likely to persist and grow. The courts are being impacted, as I've suggested, both politically, as always, but also through elections. And money in politics is mediated in some way by the media. As we proceed, I'm going to ask questions, sometimes for the whole panel, sometimes for individuals. And I would hope and would encourage the panel to feel comfortable about responding to one another, raising issues that are apposite to the question at issue. And after we finish, giving plenty of time for the debate, and for some of you, time for baseball, we will in fact provide you with an opportunity to write questions that you have for the panel, And I will read your questions so that there is not just me asking questions. I think that as I've mentioned, that the media have benefited substantially in financial ways from the new political discourse that is focused so much on them, both at election time and to provide exposure to politicians. So my first question is there evidence that views actually change? What we do and what we know about the political psychology of allegiance. And we are all told that there's a very tiny middle, that maybe, in fact, in the middle, they are one party or the other, but it's unclear, but it's relatively small. And the question is, with all this money, is there any evidence that it has any significant effect on outcomes? That's my first question. They'll deteriorate from there. Anybody who wants.
I'll start. Thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be here. I think that it is difficult to measure, and you're seeing now a slight kind of revisionist analysis saying that, in fact, all this money may not be having that much of an effect. There was actually an article in the Wall Street Journal the other day suggesting that. I think the money is important in two ways. I think the direct effect is hard to measure, although you're certainly not going to see interest groups or politicians stop advertising on television. They're not going to be willing to take the risk. And the fact that you have a kind of arms race that balances itself out doesn't mean that there's no effect. It may mean that you just have mutually assured, if not destruction, mutually assured propaganda. But I think the indirect effect is that this huge influx of money represents another factor in the coarsening of political dialogue, and that increasingly we are moving to a world where rather than trying to reach rough consensus, as the founding fathers had in mind, we have a polarized country where more and more, instead of real discourse, or real debate, and that's one reason I think the debate was so influential, because it was so different. Instead of real debate, you have just commercials, essentially. And television has contributed to that, not just as the vehicle for the most powerful commercials, but also television news to some degree has also gravitated, with some notable exceptions, toward this coverage of the race as though it were a sporting event. The two analogies that come to mind, one is sports, with the comebacks and reversals of fortune and so on, and the second is speed trading on Wall Street, kind of computerized trading, where things are speeded up so much that you have less and less time for reflection. There's more of a premium on being clever than on being smart, and as a result, you have a very significant place in the dialogue for paid media, which I don't think is ideal for the democracy.
And just to jump in on the money question, I mean, it's hard to show causality in these things, but we could spend all night listing examples of campaigns where the richer candidate, the candidate that spent more money, actually lost. I mean, look at Meg Whitman, the former CEO of eBay, who ran for governor of California last time, lost. So I mean, I don't think it's not like the richer candidate always wins. I mean, ultimately, people are decrying the level of spending this election, but you can't buy the election. I mean, the election is about who gets more votes. So ultimately, the power of voters is always going to trump the power of money. It's all about convincing the voters.
Nina?
I just wanted to add that the debate are very important, and they're getting more important because not only that we have less time to reflect, it's all happening in real time. And so the debates itself have always outlived their purpose, because it really is an officially beauty contest. It's no longer even a discussion. It has been like that since the beginning, since the first televised debate. Remember this amazing debate between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy in 1960. John Kennedy looked relaxed, Richard Nixon didn't. The beauty contest was lost, and then we can go through history all the way. There was a Carter-Reagan debate in 1980. Actually, by the way, the second, I think, or the first most watched debate was at 85, 81 million people. Once again, Reagan looked like an uncle that everybody wanted to have a drink with, and Carter looked snooty and whatnot. So we have to remember that the debates, as much as we may want to think that they were about issues, they were, but it was also always, I'm a propaganda person, so it was always a very much of a beauty contest. It was always how you, Nixon, he did not have makeup. He chose not to have makeup in 1960. And that really, to a degree, did him in. And so I think what have changed today is that the vehicle of the debate, if we talk about the media, has changed. Before, you have a debate and then you have pundits talk about it. And the next morning, you may have or may not have public opinion. We watched the debate between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, and what we learned is that while they were debating, there was already information coming in. Barack Obama is not doing well, Mitt Romney is doing well. So the whole audience debaters relations have changed tremendously, and in some ways it has become a very outdated concept, because the candidates are now driven by the media rather than given to the media. And I think that we'll see that in probably another 4 years. It would be an interesting phenomenon to watch how the debate will change, because they will drive the candidate rather than the other way around.
If I could just jump in on the Obama-Romney debate here, I thought one of the most striking things about what happened in terms of the media, how the media sort of shapes the narrative of the campaign, is Ben Smith, who's the journalist who runs the website BuzzFeed, wrote an article titled How Romney Won the Debate, and he wrote it about 45 minutes into the debate. The debate wasn't even over yet.
And it sparked a lot of controversy.
It sparked a lot of controversy, but I mean, you know, the narrative, that narrative stood, and I mean, you can kind of, even before that article, you can see consensus sort of congealing on Twitter is sort of where it happens, or at least that's where I see it. So yeah, I mean, it's happening like very, you know, sort of like in real time at this point.
It seems to me that one of the problems in answering your question is that the way the media covers the money issue right now is, how much has the Obama campaign raised and is spending versus how much has the Romney campaign raised and is spending. The great unknown this year is, because of Citizens United, which we're not going to re-examine, that we don't know how much money the super PACs have raised and are spending, and we won't know in time necessarily to be able to do anything about it. And that could be the great whale, the underground thing that determines this campaign, number one. Number two, on money and politics, Noam Chomsky isn't on the stage, so I'll speak for him, but even though I don't agree with him on a lot of things. But Chomsky would point out the real impact of money is who owns the media, not how much money has this candidate raised versus that candidate. And that is a determining factor on everything, including what they cover. In his latest blog, if I remember correctly, pointed out that in the debate that we recently saw, what he regarded as the two great issues of our time, global warming and nuclear proliferation, didn't come up, and that there's something wrong with the system that makes that happen. And then thirdly, I would say, as you know, I've been working on a book about cartoons and imagery. So what Nina says is very interesting to me, because in 30 years at The Nation magazine, which is a bastion of word people, only once did the staff march on my office with a petition demanding that we not publish something, and it was a cartoon, a caricature by David Levine, the greatest caricature of our time, arguably, of Henry Kissinger, as David put it when he called me and asked would we run it, because the New York Review wouldn't. It showed Kissinger on top and the world on bottom in the form of a woman, and Kissinger was screwing the world under an American flag blanket. The staff objected. The petition said things like sexist and why isn't he doing it to a third world male? We ran the cartoon, and it later on ended at the top of a catalog at Harvard University, on the cover of a catalog at Harvard, and it was selected to be in various shows. But the point is the power of imagery, which is what Nina was talking about, forces me, in thinking about it, to go back to my assumption, I'm a card-carrying member of the ACLU, and I agree with the Enlightenment, and I believe with Habermas and the power of the better argument. But if cartoons or images, including Nixon's 5 o'clock shadow, have a greater power than words, then we have to rethink all of our premises, including what money is spent on and the way in which it flows through this culture and this economy and this panel. So, thank you.
Before we move on, I want to make sure I understand, Victor. So you think that media ownership has something to do with nuclear proliferation not coming up in the debate? You got to explain that one.
I think that Noam Chomsky
But
would argue.
You said you're representing him.
Would argue, and I'm going to do my best to represent him, but I don't pretend to be his most effective advocate here. I do think that media ownership determines who is on that platform, and it may be a good thing, but it determines the Green candidates, for example, are not on that platform. And when Nader ran, he had trouble getting on the platform. And that has to do with money. It has to do with a theory about what people are interested in, a democratic theory of politics, and what are the different ways that you choose who gets to speak. And I think that ownership is one of the major variables in that. And money matters. So I do believe that, but I don't think it's one-on-one. I don't think that some capitalist called and said, hey, don't ask about nuclear proliferation.
Good. I want to make sure you weren't suggesting that.
No, I wasn't, and I don't think Chomsky would suggest that either. And so
Jeff?
there we are. Good.
Well, first of all, I hope I don't have to follow Victor on every question, but three things in his tradition. First of all, so you asked, does money matter? And there's going to be, as you said, about $2 billion spent by the candidates, probably another couple $1 billion spent by all the interest groups and independent expenditures around the process. So maybe even close to $5 billion overall. And the irony of it is that most of that money is going to be targeted towards the 6% of the population that is shutting the door on the canvasser, slamming down the phone on the phone banker, throwing the mailer out before they get inside their house, and just in every possible way, tuning out all of that communication. And so it's just an extraordinary waste of resources in a lot of respects. So does it matter? Well, I think it matters in some races, but not in others. Money matters, paradoxically, least in the biggest race, right? Because the presidential race is so well covered that we feel like we kind of get to know these guys running for president. And so it doesn't matter as much. In a U.S. House race, it matters a great deal. The overwhelming percentage of the time in U.S. House races, the candidate who spends the most money wins. It's true even more so at state legislative races. So, it's sort of a bimodal distribution. Money matters least in like a town council race when there's only 5,000 voters, because a candidate can go knock on every one of those doors. It also doesn't matter very much at the biggest level, but it's in the middle, like a U.S. House race, where I think it matters the most. And then finally, another reason it doesn't matter that much in a lot of races increasingly is because, as I think Justin and some other folks mentioned, the extreme polarization of the electorate. 30 years ago, if you wanted to know how someone was going to vote, you had to ask them their opinions on different issues. Now, my research suggests that the only two real questions you need to figure out how most people are going to vote is know what race they are, and if they're white, ask them what they were doing on Sunday morning. If they were in church, they're probably voting Republican. So since there's a sociological basis to that heavily influences voting, all the money doesn't mean as much as some think.
But Jeffrey, don't you think that I'm going to accept everything you've said as being true, but Also, the conventional wisdom this year is that most people have already made up their minds. So what the election is really about is a small number of people, whether it's 3%, 5% of people who are in the so-called swing states. And those people, we don't know what money the super PACs are spending in the districts where those people are. And on the local media, newspapers and television and radio, we don't know how it's aimed at that small number of people. So it could really, this election, while it's determined largely by the deeper forces, as you're suggesting, by who goes to church and who doesn't, and what race people is at, or what race people have, nevertheless, the flow of money, which we can't keep track of because of Citizens United, which we're not allowed to talk about, is going to determine this election. Maybe.
I mean, the other thing that's going to determine the election, though, is not who does vote, but who doesn't vote. I mean, in 2008, which I think broke records for turnout in federal elections, the turnout was something, I think it was like 64%. So, I mean, it's a third of the population, over a third of the population that decided not to vote. So, I mean, you can't blame the money there, right? I mean, I guess I'm just coming back to the point that you can spend as much money as you want, but in the end, it's about people voting. That they're the ones determining the election.
I agree with that, although I think if I were, later on in the evening, I'll explain why I was called a campaign mismanager, but if I were managing this campaign, I would, and I wanted to bring out the vote, I would have cars to bring senior citizens in districts where we know where they're going to vote, to pick up every one of them if I had enough money, and take them to the polling place. And I would have lawyers who would be challenging the voter identification laws in states where they were put in place to prevent people from voting. And I'd have the lawyers there early, and I'd have them filing major briefs to change that.
As a mismanager of a major campaign, I want to respond slightly, if I may, with my next question, which teases out some of the things that were implicit in what you were saying. And let me pose it this way. Let's suppose that there were easily available facts about the policy perspectives of candidates, how they voted, how they would vote on some kind of hypothetical issue, enough questions and responses to those questions from candidates that you would actually know a great deal about where they stood as representatives of the people. Implicit in what I'm hearing is that that would be totally irrelevant, that in fact, knowing what the candidates stand for, except in the most general way, and this comes out, by the way, in interviews that members of the media have had with people at, why do you like so-and-so? And the answer has nothing whatsoever to do with the quality of the candidate, with the way the candidate would respond to particular issues. So I guess my question is, since it was implicit in what was said earlier, that, and I think said in a clear way about if you are this race and so forth, that you would vote this way, that voting behavior is a function of certain kinds of assumptions, sometimes hidden, which are reflected in something about your life, and that's enough to determine the outcome. When I was a child, there was a story in astounding science fiction that statistical methods were developed to a far-thee-well, and that everybody knew that if Sally Jones were asked how she would vote in the election, that would be determinative, because the rest of the society would vote that way as well. I'm hearing something of that there are descriptors that are sufficient to determine how this comes out, and that all the talk about policy, to the extent that there is any, is irrelevant. So that's my question is that implicit in what you folks feel?
Can I start with this? It's 17%, by the way, undecided, which I think is a lot of percentage, given how much the country has been divided in the last 12 years, who is who and whatnot. I think it's not entirely irrelevant, but anybody who looks at PR or propaganda would tell you, of course, that a lot of these studies are very, very important white, black, goes to church, doesn't go to church, city, not city, and whatnot. And I think we've seen it all along, and we saw it in 2000 and then 2004 with the absolutely brilliant campaign of Karl Rove, who studied those things very, very carefully and moved them forward. And we got George Bush for 8 years. So this is something incredibly important, and the issues are readily available. In fact, since I was following the first debate, it was all, oh no, this is wrong, and it was all tweeted where Romney lied, where Obama lied, and Romney certainly lied more, not that Obama didn't, and it didn't matter in the end, because the whole idea was that because Romney presented the issues better, that's why he was a better candidate. I also wanted to respond to Victor when you said, and I think it's so true, that image matters more than the words, and America has to rethink itself. Image does matter a tremendous amount. I don't know about more than the words, but saying that America has to rethink itself, I'm not entirely sure that it's un-American to have that kind of worldview, because shout out to my students who are in the audience. Thank you for coming. If you read Max Weber and The Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, one of the greatest lines that he has, that in Protestant ethics, what is important is perception of truth is more important than truth itself, and so that probably is a result of it has been over 100 years, and so here we are. I mean, it's an obvious conclusion.
Yeah, so I think a lot of church-going Democrats would be surprised to hear that they're automatically voting Republican. I don't agree with that.
I didn't say they're automatically, but they're overwhelmingly likely to.
Yeah, okay, I'm teasing, but I don't think we shouldn't confuse these traits, which are indicators, with causality. I think that you're right, Neil, that there isn't, that most voters either don't have the time or the inclination to study policy in depth. I do think that the information is available. It's not easily available, but it's also not hard to find, especially now that we have very powerful tools for search, and it's widely, it's not hard to find if you really care. But I think one of the real problems, and it's reflected in the statistic that Justin gave of the number of people who didn't vote, there's still widespread apathy. There are people who, for either apathy or cynicism, but either way, they don't feel they have a deep stake in the outcome, not a deep enough stake to go deeply into the policy and find out how the candidate feels about all those issues that you listed. But I think the fact that more churchgoers might vote, white churchgoers might vote Republican, to me says that they feel an affinity to Republican policies. It's not because they are white churchgoers, and the same with African Americans who, for one reason or another, feel more of an affinity towards Democratic policy. So there's certainly a relationship. I think we have a highly imperfect system. It's become a cliche to say terrible, but find me a better one. And there's no question that imagery is important, but we're not, we could all get together and leave here and try to stuff that genie back in the bottle. That isn't going to happen. We because of television, and because visual media are so powerful, and there's nothing like sight, sound, and motion for creating emotion and reaction, that is going to be a very important part of political outcomes, and the successful candidates are going to not necessarily be the most beautiful or with the most resonant voices, but there's going to be something that viscerally connects with viewers. And I think that's where, again, I don't want to get in, probably don't want to get into a food fight about last week's debate, but where I think Obama disappointed a lot of people who believed in him is he allowed Romney back into a race that he had in the bag by letting Romney win on that basis. It's hard to see when you're watching it from Manhattan, but pretty shocking choke. And the interesting question to me is, to what extent does being a successful leader in the free world depend to some degree on having the attributes that we didn't see that day?
Okay, I sort of feel odd because I agree with everything everyone says, and yet I still think the dumb thing is right, that I sentimentally believe in democracy, and I'm not ready to give it up despite the power of imagery and the power of television, but I feel that money matters because it matters. Television matters, and the ability to pay for ads and commercials on television matters. Bringing out the vote matters. A debate matters, but even within that, you always have this leftover piece, the contest of people who are trying to decide what to do. Some decide based on what they hear, and others decide based on other factors that are deeper in their cultural thing. But I'm now going to come back to my friend Chomsky for a second. I want to do justice to him because I feel guilty that I'm not adequately representing him. And here's what he said about nuclear proliferation. What he said was that the issue, the way we hear about nuclear issues these days has to do with Iran, and that, in fact, Chomsky speaking, not Navasky speaking, although I agree with part of what he says here. In fact, he says, the Israelis have the bomb, the Americans have the bomb, the Pakistanis have the bomb, the Indians have the bomb. Why shouldn't the Iranians be allowed to have the bomb? And that and he cites all these various international protocols which permit the development of uranium for peaceful purposes, which is what they claim they're doing, and our own intelligence on what they are doing and what other people are doing has been proven faulty in connection with our report that there were mass weapons before the Iraq War. So that is a very important debate that is not being had right now because neither of the major parties are interested in having it, and the networks, all of which, Chomsky speaking now, are dominated by big money, don't want to have that debate. And there's where we can part ways with Chomsky, but nevertheless, it does help set the lines of what people are talking about and why. And if there was an anti-nuclear party, if Jonathan Schell were up here and he had the funding that Obama has and that Romney has, and we're able to organize an anti-nuclear party, that might be part of and he were given a platform by the TV networks in the debates with the major candidates, that view might be heard and might become part of the debate itself, whether or not his party had any role to play. So that's my thought for this.
Jeff?
With all due respect, Victor,
Yes.
I don't think that the networks are deciding anything. I think that there's two campaigns, and they each spend about 7 or 8% of their money on polling. And they're each going to spend almost $1 billion, which means they're going to spend about $75 million figuring out what people want to talk about or want to hear about, and that's the economy. And so Barack Obama, that was sort of one of his trademark policies that he talked about in 2008, was he worked on nuclear non-proliferation across the aisle with Senator Lugar from Indiana. You know, he used that as sort of, I know how to work across party lines and don't want to go back to the partisanship of the Clinton years, ironically. But the point is that if anybody's qualified to talk about that issue, he is. I just think their polling is suggesting that that's not really what people want to hear about right now.
I also think here, I mean, and I think I'm probably agreeing with Victor on this point, I mean, the bias of sort of the establishment media is towards the establishment politicians. Like, the fact of the matter is, Obama and Romney have extremely similar policies on Iran, so they're just not talking about it. So the media is not, the mainstream media is not going to talk about it, not going to ask them about it, because what would they, I mean, if Jim Lehrer got up there and said, what do you think we should do in Iran? Like, their answers are basically the same.
One could give a lot of justifications. Polling is certainly one of them. Another is an unease about speaking publicly on issues that are very vexed, very difficult, that are being argued out in the literature as to what the right response is. And that ties me back to a question that's somewhat related, because you seem to have anticipated my questions, having to do with the question of interviewed politicians who want, as a quid pro quo to their interview being published, that they have a right to edit it. Now, if they believed, in fact, that what they say isn't terribly important because all that the people care about is, in fact, the economy, they would worry less about that. But you also have the media who are responding too often positively to that imprecation from the interviewee.
Well, that just isn't true. this notion of quote approval is very controversial. It is against the standards of every mainstream news organization. It crept in quietly on little cat's feet until it was called out by journalists recently in the case of the New York Times, I believe it was, and immediately the Times reinstated or restated its policy against it. So we should not leave this audience with the impression that there's a widespread practice of journalists of giving politicians the right to edit interviews. That simply isn't the case. There are plenty of other ways, some of them insidious, where I think politicians and journalists are quiet co-conspirators in our political dialogue, which I think ought to be much better than it is. But Neil, forgive me, with respect, that just isn't one of them.
Well, except, Andrew, isn't it true that in the entertainment world, the practice has been for years to let stars agree or not agree to be interviewed based on whether you promise them cover position or not?
Yes, that's true.
And that's something
That's not what we're talking about here.
Well, but that's something that it seems has spilled over into mainstream media in some ways. The speeded up news cycle and some of the practices in that kind of lifestyle journalism. And the ability of someone you interview to what you called, Neil, editing an interview is not what they ask. What they ask for is to approve quotes. And in my experience, that has been something that for years journalists have done, whether it was against the policy of their news organization or not, to get interviews. They said you can review the quote for accuracy, but you can't say whether it can go in the story or not. And there's there would be an interesting debate about whether there's anything wrong with that as a theoretical proposition. So,
I mean, I think this does, I mean, the Times, I think, first sort of broke the story over the summer that, as Andrew said, that this practice of being able to veto quotes, that being a condition of an interview, had sort of crept into campaign reporting by the big media organizations. But I mean, you still see this, like, I don't know if anyone read Michael Lewis's piece in Vanity Fair where he went, he followed Obama around for 8 months. And I mean, there's a negotiation that goes on before this, and I think they disclosed in the article. It was definitely disclosed in the coverage of the article, which was he agreed to that very condition, which was the administration, the press office, whoever was going to get to either approve or veto quotes because he was, going around with Obama behind the scenes for 8 months. So I mean, I think that if collectively sort of journalists weren't willing to grant that condition to get that kind of access that's going to get you a Vanity Fair feature, we'd all be better off. But I think unfortunately the campaigns, which access is sort of one of the few things that that's really the big chip they hold, they're going to use that, and if they can find people to agree to it, I think we're sort of all going to lose.
What did you think of the article?
I didn't even read it.
Well, save your time.
Yeah.
I've never read 8,000 words and learned less.
You saved us all some trouble tonight, Jeff. Right? I don't think this is one of our big problems. I think you have journalists who are highly competitive. They're trying to get scoops. There are leakers in the campaigns who are putting things out, favorable and unfavorable, favorable about their person, unfavorable about the other. I still think there's pretty free flow of information. I do think that the underlying idea is a powerful and important one, and it ties in very well with what Nina was talking about, which is that the campaigns over time, starting in 1960 really, have realized that they have to package their candidates for TV. And so you're seeing fewer and fewer spontaneous moments. There are fewer and fewer occasions where you actually feel that you're a human being seeing another human being in action in an authentic way. The joke is if you can feign authenticity, you're doing great. So I think that is a problem that I think that everyone, politicians, successful ones, have gotten very slick at aphoristic sound bites and at looking right and knowing where the camera is and so on. Unfortunately, we're in the television age, and we're also now, this is now exacerbated by social networks, which are, do many things very well and are very important, but we are now in a world where literally every second counts. And that means that people are going to be increasingly careful and circumspect, and you're not going to get the unvarnished look at the politician that would actually make it easy in that kind of local election. I was very struck by Jeffrey's point that in the tiny town council, we can knock on every door. You still have, old-fashioned campaigning where money doesn't matter because they actually can look the person in the eye.
But also that puts a greater burden on the networks to do what CBS did for many years with 60 Minutes, to do their own kind of investigative reporting, what ProPublica is trying to do. And it seems to me that's the challenge to the media, to not be manipulated in this way just by money because they can afford to pay the commercials. And that's also the challenge to our society, to have regulations that limit the amount of monies that can be spent on commercials in
I agree with
political
you.
campaigns.
I agree with you.
Sure.
I think 60 Minutes and ProPublica are still doing terrific work.
Yes.
I'm all for that. I'm just not looking forward to seeing Jonathan Schell in the debate.
Right.
And by the way, Noam Chomsky is sitting in Cambridge right now channeling Victor Navasky in a debate, so it all evens out.
Good.
I'd like to ask a comparative question. We've been really focusing on U.S. politics and the role of the media, the analysis of trends that is being done in order to be able to fashion the candidates' responses to expected questions, to expected counterfactuals. We now have fact-checkers and your pants on fire folks who are presumably working really hard at getting the facts straight. I'm hearing from the panel that they might as well not bother because the facts are not going to matter that much. The candidates are packaged appropriately to evoke through their understanding of political psychology how the candidates, the voters they want to appeal to will respond to particular words said in a particular way on particular subjects they know are going to
But
resound.
that doesn't mean they should be allowed to get away with lying. And I'll shut up in a second. I don't monopolize this. But no, I think people should play their assigned roles. I think that journalists should hold people in power accountable, and they should check facts. And I think the more fact-checking organizations and Pants on Fire, the better. But we just be aware that the politicians are not sitting there waiting for journalists to determine the outcome of the race.
Okay,
Is the politician's assigned role to tell the lies and the journalists to expose them? That's
The politician's assigned role is to get elected, and the journalist's job is to try to keep them honest.
and the voters' role?
Shall we start speaking?
Of course.
No, but was there a question? Were
Yes,
you
I was really addressing a question to you about
here I am.
a comparative perspective on the way these trends that we've been discussing seem to manifest themselves in a variety of settings. In Russia, for example, and I would start there since
Right.
you
Okay.
are certainly an expert in that area.
Totally. That I am. I actually wanted to, interesting that you asked this question because I was thinking we're having the debate about the politicians and the media and how things don't matter because people are not interested. And I actually would like to say that democracy is a privilege and a choice, and somebody who is a former Soviet, I have to tell you, it really is a luxury that we all have, having those kind of debates and this kind of conversations and actually decide whose candidate's tie is better, and also can at the same time check the facts. So it is, the facts are available. It's our responsibility to know that. And I think the problem is that gap between things are fed to us and we accept that. And we shouldn't be, because that is, context matters, and our own intellectual curiosity or political curiosity matter even more. If I don't want to hijack the Russian conversation because I can certainly go on for hours on that. But as somebody who had to vote for one candidate, it's not even a candidate, for one person for most of my life, and they would be 96% attendance, 98% approval, you have to know that choice is a privilege, and this is something that we all have to consider. And Philip Roth, very amazing American writer, actually said it better than than anybody, putting it in comparative perspective, is that in Eastern Europe or under communism, nothing was permitted, but everything mattered. And in a democracy and capitalism, everything is permitted and nothing matters. And I really think that, that somewhere in the middle, the truth should be money, politics, politicians. The people really have to play that role, and that goes to your point on apathy, because it is a great luxury, and being apathetic or non-democratic, we can end up with a candidate. In fact, we did. In various years in previous decade, that really not beneficial to the United States. So, speaking as a former Soviet, I have to say, it's our responsibility.
May I just clarify something that I said earlier about the 6% or 7% in the middle? I didn't say that issues don't matter at all in American politics. And I didn't say that people aren't interested in public policy. What I do suggest is that the notion of the thoughtful, independent, taking account of the candidates' positions and saying, well, you know, I support Romney on getting tough on China and his policy on the Middle East, but I do support Obamacare and his position on, you know, women's reproductive freedom, and I'm just trying to balance, you know, to figure out which is more important. That's really rare among those independents. The people who are most interested in issues and policy tend to be the partisans, you know, on either side. So I'm not trying to paint the entire electorate with that broad brush, more so the undecided voters.
But let me put your comment in a slightly different perspective. And hearing what I've heard, which I find quite persuasive, that the responsibility of a candidate is to get elected, the responsibility of the media is to be successful financially, the responsibility of the voter is presumably to vote in somebody who will maximally benefit the country. And my question of you is, does a campaign enable most of us to be able to predict what kind of governing a particular elected person will engage in? That is, are campaigns about predicting the direction in which the country's going to go, or are they about something completely different, making us feel better, making us have trust in particular individuals who might change their mind 12 times? Are we able, as a polity, to use the information we have to determine how effective our president is going to be?
How effective, or what he or she is going to try to do?
What he or she's going to try to do. I appreciate that.
Because to me, that's the key question, what Andrew asked, because I think part of the disillusion with Obama is what he said he wanted to do and what's happened under him. And then the question becomes, whose fault is it what's happened under him? Is it his fault, or is it the Congress's fault, as in the new Republican Tea Party Congress syndrome fault? But in certain elections, clearly, there's a mandate, and it's possible to fulfill the mandate if the vote is for it. In others, and this may be one of the others, whatever the vote is, it depends what the mix is between the Congress and the executive as to what you can get done. But I'm interested in what Jeffrey said, because there's an assumption, Jeffrey, to me, in it that the truth is someplace between two extremes. And in fact, in some cases, one of the extremes may be the truth. And that's the idea that you give equal time to Democrats and Republicans is an interesting idea to me, and maybe the best we could do at the time. But at a magazine like The Nation, for example, they have a debate. It's not a party line magazine. It's a debate with more space between the different people who write for it, but very different definitions of what the two sides are. There are radical feminists who believe that pornography should not be permitted. There are civil libertarians who believe nothing should not be permitted to be said. There are top-down socialist planners, and there are bottom-up Greens, and there are anarchists and there are socialists, and there's more space between those extremes than there is between Democrats and Republicans. So the question is, you know, Paul, when you said earlier that the economy is what's on everybody's mind and what's most important, and that's why what the focus is and should be on, I think of Paul Krugman's columns. And Paul Krugman, if you read him as you do, basically says there aren't two sides to most of these questions. Now, one could say, well, that's because he's on one side and he doesn't see the conservative side to this. He says, no, no, no. It's not because I'm on one side. It's because those guys just don't understand the way the economy really works. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, and that's the question. And then how does the campaign play into that, and what is the effect of money on that in terms of how the media treats the campaign? Does it treat it as just he says, she says? Does it treat it with its own assumptions of what the permissible limits of debate are? And does money affect that? Those are the questions that it seems to me are very important for us to grapple with, including Nina's question about what we permit as citizens.
Well, another question about the media relevant to that very point, and that is, can the media encourage, or would it even want to, frank discussions about policy questions? And would that make a difference in our politics? I asked the question, having lived in Paris for a year when Giscard d'Estaing was running for office. And he came on the television with a blackboard and chalk to explain the French budget to all of France. I can't imagine anything with that kind of detail, or even roughly.
I guarantee he was on state TV.
Oh, fine. Fair enough. Fair enough. He was surely on state TV.
I don't know, just to jump in there, the part of Mitt Romney's stump speeches, he actually does break out a whiteboard and he does a little thing with a marker, I think, talking about like Obamacare or tax policy or something. I actually think that if you look at what the candidates are talking about, and to some extent what the media is talking about, this is one of the most substantive campaigns we've had in a while. I mean, like, we're talking about the nitty-gritty of tax policy and healthcare policy down to more details than probably most of us really care to think about usually. And I think, I don't know, I guess it's probably a good thing. I mean, there's still plenty of sort of analysis of what color ties they're wearing as well. But I think that stuff, the substance is there this time.
I'm with Justin on this. I think Victor mentioned 60 Minutes. There was a terrific episode of 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago, half an interview with Romney and half with Obama, and it was nothing but policy. Nothing but policy. Very detailed, granular questioning.
It can be very boring.
I guess, but it's exactly what you would describe. It maybe not Giscard at the board, but still very informative for people who are interested in that sort of thing. I think there's a danger of being too cynical about all this. I think that I'm with Nina. I think the real issue is that if the public refused to be led around by the latest soundbite or the latest commercial, then the system would change. Mm-hmm. Well, I shouldn't be saying that Nina, because Nina didn't say that. I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I was sort of saying, because we talk about the debate and how Romney won and Obama lost, and supposedly it should matter, because if we look at issues, those who believe that Barack Obama has better issues should continue to believe that, and nonetheless, now they're on the same, I think they're both either 47 or 49% or so. Right. So it did matter quite a bit. But what I was going to say about your comparison with France, I mean, I just gave a passionate plea of somebody who was a communist and no longer, and so how bad it was for us and how great it is for you. But I also would like to caution us comparing America to other countries, because France just went through another election. Hollande, Sarkozy, and there was an amazing debate. I followed it very closely. There was an amazing debate for 2 hours. They really talked about policy. So it's just a very different culture. They also have 3-month vacation. So it is a very different culture and very different way of approaching issues and politics. Some of it is very beneficial, some of it is a handicap and whatnot, but it would not be a direct comparison, because we still agreed, all of us, that it does seem that in America is much more of a beauty contest, and there they do talk about real issues, but that's what makes America America, so we don't want to take it away from us as well.
Just one quick point of clarification. A lot of people are talking about how many minds changed after the debate because the polling moved, but it wasn't necessarily that minds changed. A lot of these pollsters are taking partisan identification as exogenous, which basically means they're not reweighting for partisan ID. So they're finding, it may be, that Republicans are more enthusiastic about picking up the phone and telling a pollster, hey, yeah, I support this guy, after, a lot of them didn't support him in the primary, weren't excited about him at all, but then finally, after last week, got excited. Conversely, a lot of Democrats are kind of depressed and not really wanting to say, hey, I'm really psyched about Obama anymore. So the samples, the people's self-identification in the polling the last few days has kind of shifted in terms of the partisan weight. So it may not be that people changed their minds or were persuaded, but just that certain people are more excited about revealing their choices.
What I would like to do for just a couple of minutes before we take your questions is ask you if there are issues that should be addressed regarding politics and the media, throw in money, throw in technology, that are key that I did not have the wit to raise with you.
Yeah, sure. Repeal Citizens United, #1. That's what Jeffrey was like. Recognize Cuba. It's not discussed at all. Global warming. How about starting with green jobs? Roll back the military, which Obama, it's the opposite of what Romney is talking about. I mean, there are a whole bunch of things that it seems to me.
Victor, you didn't tell
drones,
us. You didn't tell us how you mismanaged that last campaign.
Well, I'm happy to, it sounds like a diversion from the serious discussion we're having, but I'll tell you in brief since you asked. So when I was editing this little satire magazine called Monocle, as in Monocle, our motto was, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. It was many years ago. It was 1964, and Barry Goldwater was running for president of the United States. It was while the civil rights movement was going strong in the South. Martin Luther King, and there were sit-ins, there were freedom riders, and the country was at odds, and it was Goldwater versus, and it became Lyndon Johnson. And Marvin Kitman, who was an editor at Monocle Magazine, was a registered Republican. He was the only guy in the office old enough to run for president. He was 35 years old. And so he announced that he was more conservative than Goldwater, because Goldwater only went back as far as McKinley, whereas Kitman went all the way back to Abraham Lincoln. And in 1964, he was running on the 1864 Republican platform, which called for the freeing of the slaves, the unconditional surrender of the South, and the reinforcement of the garrison at Fort Sumter. So we went out to the convention. We went to New Hampshire, and we got delegates to sign petitions for him. We went out to the convention, and he made a major showing out there. So that was the campaign I mismanaged.
So. No wonder you're bitter about only having 2 candidates.
Well, I'm a sore loser.
Exactly.
So
you're still smarting from that rebuke.
Right.
I don't know how, do you all have cards? And have some of you...
This is a small room. Why don't we have people just stand up? We can hear
Okay,
that.
sure.
Yeah,
That'll be fine. We don't have a microphone.
We'll repeat the question if we can hear it, in case other people can't.
Are there questions that you would like to address either to the entire panel or to an individual?
Don't be shy.
Yes, way in the back.
Can't hear.
It's going to be a little hard for us to hear. If you could speak a little more loudly.
Sure.
One is, if voting was mandatory in the U.S., do you think that would affect the campaigns, and if so, how? And the second one is, I recently saw an interview by WikiLeaks' Julian Assange. She was interviewing Rafael Correa from Ecuador, and Correa said that there's more differences between what he thinks in the morning and at night than Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. And I was just wondering if you guys agree with that and what you...
Did everybody hear the questions?
Heard the first, but not the second.
The first question was about mandatory voting. If we had it, how would that affect people's voting? The other was the changeability of the lived life. If you imagine yourself thinking quite differently between the morning and the evening, are those differences even more profound than between being a Republican and a Democrat? Is that about right?
On the first question, I don't know about the mandatory, but I report on campaign finance, and if you talk to the sort of pro-campaign finance reform people now, yeah, they hate Citizens United, but they don't think unless somebody on the Supreme Court dies and Obama gets to replace them, there's not really any chance of reversing that anytime soon. So kind of like the smart money in the campaign finance reform world is going towards basically exactly what you're talking about, which is increasing turnout, getting people who don't vote to vote, also public financing, matching small donations. And I think their theory is that, yeah, if you can broaden the base of voters, that can beat money in this system. I mean, basically just what I said before. I mean, the votes versus money, like the votes will win. If you can institute policy, I mean, like, and there are things short of mandatory voting, like having a national holiday on election day, and there's a whole list of things you could do. And that's where a lot of sort of the campaign finance reform policy wonks are focusing right now. So it's an interesting point.
So just explain why, I'm not disagreeing, I want to understand it better.
Speak into the microphone.
Just explain why, if more people voted, money would be less important. Why wouldn't there just be more money directed at more people?
I don't think it would necessarily be less important, but I think the theory of the people who are pursuing that strategy is that that the people who aren't voting, I mean, there would just be a democratizing effect. I mean, it would engage more of the country. I mean, I don't think the theory is necessarily that the country would move left or something, although maybe some people do believe that, and maybe that's why they're making the argument. But I think they want a more informed electorate and a more engaged electorate, and it gets also to the point of people just seeing a 30-second ad and voting based on some lie or twisted fact versus somebody who's actually taking the time to figure out what's going on and making a decision based on it.
And do you think the expansion of the electorate would lead to a more informed electorate?
I don't know.
Because I think it would lead to a much less informed electorate overall.
Why do you say that?
Because if you're one of the people that after, $5 billion is spent to try to get you to vote, still decide not to, then I don't see you deciding just because the law is you have to vote, saying to yourself, I'm going to read up on all the issues now if I have to do this.
It actually speaks to the second half of the question, which, if I understood it correctly, the president of Ecuador said to Julian Assange, there are more differences between how I feel in the morning and how I feel at night than there are between a Republican and a Democrat, right? So I guess, what do you think about that one, Jeffrey?
He had a different feeling in the morning than he does right now.
Yeah, what do you think? What do you feel tonight about that?
That's Mitt Romney you're referring to. But I think
Right. You got me.
I think it's completely wrong. I think you have enormous differences between these two candidates. You have one candidate that's out there saying, I want to protect the guarantee for seniors to be on Medicare, and another candidate saying, I want to let the private market, in. Whatever you think about that being a good idea or a bad idea. And I thought, to your point earlier, they really got pretty deep into policy in the last debate. Barack Obama spent 90 seconds explaining the concept of adverse selection to the country. You don't see that in many presidential debates, but that's a big difference between the two parties. One party has a platform that says there should be no exceptions for rape or incest, when it comes to women's reproductive freedom. The other party has a platform saying women should have the right to control their own bodies completely. One party, Barack Obama says we need to find a way to do a grand bargain that is balanced and raises taxes on the top 2% of income earners. The other side, Mitt Romney has said, if there were $10 of spending cuts for every dollar in tax hikes, I'm still against it because I don't want to raise any taxes. Those are giant policy differences, so I couldn't disagree more with that.
But the other thing, excuse me.
Nina, go ahead.
Well,
No, you go.
Nina, go ahead.
Nina, don't be
You're
so
sitting
nice.
in the
Come
middle.
on, come on.
I've just ruled.
Okay, well, thank you. Very quick, to your point, mandatoriness, I think, trumps democracy at all times. So mandatory would not work precisely because what Jeff was saying. That is a problem. Anybody who tried it, just take my word for it. And as for presentation, I think it is interesting how a lot of countries, and that's why I thought that French comparison and a Russian comparison, a lot of countries would think that because America does have that luxury of showing off the candidates and whatnot. And actually, those who followed issues would agree that probably in private, Mitt Romney and Barack Obama wouldn't disagree on that many party-wise, yes. But in private, if you look at Mitt Romney's record, it's a very mild record. What was interesting is that because the country is so polarized, both parties drag both the candidates far apart than they really are. And something back to your point again is that we also want to watch the show. I mean, would it be really incredibly boring to see them agreeing in all issues and say, oh, Obamacare, oh, but actually I had that thing, oh, but I cannot have that now because I have to argue with Barack Obama. So I think that this is sort of a very interesting, unbalanced debate here.
Well, a slightly different perspective. I agree with Nina that it's on the surface, it goes against the American grain to have mandatory voting. On the other hand, we have mandatory income taxes, and it seems to me there are countries around the world, different cultures, that have mandatory voting where it doesn't seem to have hurt them. My question is, in answer to Jeffrey's point about would you think people would vote differently if there were mandatory voting, is that going back to your earlier point, most of the sociological studies show that the people who don't vote are poor people, they're people of color, and they are, so they have a starting politics. And one of the really interesting questions is why don't people vote their interests? And the question is if those folks voted their interests, whether or not they had television sets to watch to sort out the issues is a whole other question. Would we be better or worse off? And why doesn't that happen?
I think we should take another question because that's going to be a tough issue to help us resolve. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
There's a microphone here now.
How much do you think the changes in the business structure of the media in the last 20 years have affected the elections? And in two respects. One, the conglomeration of media power into fewer and fewer hands, examples being News Corp and Time Warner. And the second, the decline of the print media due to the impact of the internet and the social media. How have those two changes affected the elections?
Andrew, you want to take the first part?
Sure. I think I'm in a minority on the panel here, but I don't think that media consolidation has had a significant effect on the election, anywhere near as significant as any of the other things that we've discussed. I think the fact that we don't teach civics in school anymore, I think is much more important than the fact that a few media companies have the power. I think that we actually, in news, there are lots of sources of news. There's a tremendously free flow of information. Anybody, as I said, who wants to learn about the candidates can do so, not just from American sources, but from international sources. There are all sorts of independent journalists who didn't have access before. We actually have a much more democratized media. So the fact that entertainment and mainstream journalism is consolidated doesn't mean there are fewer voices debating, discussing, and analyzing. I think the problems are elsewhere. I think the second half of your question, which I'll leave to somebody else, is germane. I think that there has been a deleterious effect on the money for original reporting. You talk about what ProPublica is and why it has to exist.
Yeah, I mean, just to the first part of the question, I mean, I think it's kind of an odd paradoxical phenomenon because I think the core sort of establishment, big media companies, like you say, you've seen consolidation over the past couple of decades, but at the same time, mainly because of the internet, outside of that core, there's been a democratization or at least sort of a, partial flowering of other media sources. I mean, I used to work at Talking Points Memo, which is, it started as basically just a guy's blog, and now my old boss employs probably 20 people or something like that. And obviously, Talking Points Memo is not going to have the effect that Fox News is going to have or anywhere near the audience. But at the same time, they punch above their weight. Nothing like that could have existed. I think there's alternative voices on every sort of from every side of the political spectrum, left, right, whatever, that have much more of an effect on how the CBSs of the world and who still control the debates, and those are the media outlets that are going to produce sort of the debate moderators, and they still have a huge audiences. But I think I think there's just a lot of smaller media outlets out there, ideological, that have much more of an effect on the core than they used to 20 years ago, despite that consolidation that you talked about.
All right, let's take your question. You nominated yourself to
Okay.
ask a question, and perhaps if we have time, we'll take one more.
Yeah, I'd just like to direct a question to Mr. Heyward about one of my favorite movies, Network, from the mid-1970s, about when this whole process began, when news programs started to become more sensitive to ratings, and, Faye Dunaway comes in and takes over the place, and William Holden is the old-time journalist. He's trying to keep it real, like a Cronkite, Walter Cronkite. Did you see any of that going on at CBS when you were there? And also, since the 70s, we've had a huge polarization of wealth in our society. We have concentration at the top. I just finished a book called The Looting of America by Les Leopold, about how the derivatives, made this huge concentration, the fantasy finance, he calls it, and how much is that money now also controlling the process, the media, and also the politics?
Well, I'll speak to the first one, try to be brief. So I was head of CBS News for 10 years, ending at the end of 2005. And Network was a brilliant satire by Pat Chayefsky, so nothing as ludicrous or outlandish as that happened. But that said, there's no question that if you look at all television news, entertainment values play a larger role than they did when television news was invented in the years after World War II in the 50s and 60s. It was very sober and serious and separate, and now they're and this actually may speak to this other gentleman's question to a degree, to the extent that the profit motive as opposed to consolidation has become something that news executives have to worry about, and you have to chase circulation, you're going to make certain decisions. But those decisions, they affect, I think it's a common perception, I think, we were kidding around with Victor earlier, common perception that the advertisers or these plutocrats are calling the shots. That certainly doesn't happen at the broadcast networks. I can't speak for all cable networks quite as authoritatively, but what does happen is your story selection is governed by a notion of popularity. Not every single story, but there's even kind of a term, cross subsidies, where you kind of cover certain stories knowing that they're going to be popular in order to be able to afford other things. This is the way newspapers introduce lifestyle sections to subsidize their coverage of Afghanistan. And certainly in television, where it's more of a zero-sum game, where you can't cover everything, I think there are a lot of very important issues, including some of the ones that Victor listed, that are undercovered on TV because they don't have broad appeal, and that's because of the need to garner ratings. So while you may not see a Sybil the Soothsayer on the news, you do see story selection governed to some degree by circulation. And also the last thing I'll say is, despite all of that, in addition to things like 60 Minutes or CBS Sunday Morning, the evening newscasts are still remarkably serious, and they really try to fulfill their responsibility. I think the morning is where you see entertainment values at war. We were talking about it earlier. The morning is where you see the entertainment values much more dominant than they were.
One other thing I'd say on that, and I don't know if anyone's actually doing this, but I'm kind of skeptical of sort of idealized past narratives of how great the media was for democracy in, like, I don't know, the age of Walter Cronkite or something. I mean, like, was it really, I mean, like, were things really that much different back then than they are now? Like, I'm not convinced that they were.
That was the press corps that knew JFK was cheating on his wife, and no one reported it, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, the list could go
I think all of that is true, but yet I still think, Andrew, that that conglomeratization contributes to homogenization of the media writ large. And what you say about entertainment values reinforces that impression for me. So
I think you're right about that, but the question was, how does it affect the election? And I guess to me, the fact that certain topics like the ones you listed aren't covered is more a function of the perception that they're not of great mainstream interest than because powerful media conglomerates own the companies.
Right.
Let's take one more brief question.
Nina has one.
Can I just say
Yes,
to this point?
Nina will speak while the person walks up to the microphone.
Just tiny, I mean, just to Andrew's point, which was very good. During the convention, the Republican convention, as you know, Mitt Romney did not speak about the war. And what did the media do? The media covered it to death. So we cannot really blame the media too much for not covering things. In fact, when the candidates don't talk about things that matter, the media actually steps right. And the same thing with voter suppression. I mean, we know about it because it really has been for 2 months going on, that story, and in fact some changes happen.
The one area where I think the media doesn't cover things is where the candidates agree. So like, you know, for example, right now, the presidential election, a whole lot of foreign policy issues. I mean, you know, drug war, et cetera, you know, the list could go on and on.
Yeah, they don't want to talk about it. Last question. Could you pull that microphone down so it's pointed in your mouth?
All right, so my question has to do with the role of media in terms of being a game changer for politics in comparison to looking at, for example, Egypt, and the argument made that Facebook and Twitter were kind of a game changer. I don't necessarily agree with that, but just in terms of your perception, and I guess maybe a way to frame it, what are the ways you think media was a game changer, you know, in the past 10 years, and what ways do you see it being a game changer in the next 10 years?
I think the two professors should answer that.
My children tell me I don't understand the social media and the new media there, so,
So you're agnostic.
And I think they're right. And I am agnostic because, as McLuhan has taught us, every time a new medium comes along, people say the old medium is dead, and this, you know, radio came along and it was going to do away with conversation, and the movies came along, they was going to do away with radio, television came along, it was going to do away with the movies. So I'm glad that there is Twitter. I don't know how to do it. I'm glad there's Facebook. I have a Facebook page. I've never seen it. And I'm glad, that there are all these new things happening. I think it's a good thing for the world. It makes connectivity possible and a dialogue possible. It didn't used to exist. I don't understand how it works yet, but I will eventually.
I mean, I think that that the times when the media sort of changes the game the most is not sort of the day in, day out covering the campaign, and even if you're sort of really aggressively fact-checking the candidates and you know, conducting good aggressive interviews with them. I think it's really investigative journalism. I mean, when you can force, when you can uncover things that are going on that the campaigns have to talk about, or whether or not you're in a campaign context that politicians have to talk about. I mean, you know, any sort of major investigative scoop of you know, like warrantless wiretapping during the Bush administration, Pentagon Papers. I mean, like just major investigative journalism that uncovers things that are important enough that that politicians and also campaigns have to talk about. I mean, I think that's sort of when the media has sort of the most agency.
Well, we're also talking about differences in the repressive nature of societies, in societies in which there isn't easy access to information or the presentation of information. Something like the new media can have a much more profound effect than they will in a more open society. Absolutely. Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you very much to the panel.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.